Critical Based Theory, Episode 6 The Tragedy of Modernity. When we look at some of the societies we have left behind, the modern world looks like an extraordinary achievement, perhaps one that we should take for granted at our peril. The fact that so many of us grew up expecting public funded education, a compassionate welfare state, universal healthcare, and state protection from corporal punishments by natural right is a reflection of the fact that we are probably one of the most fortunate generations in history. And this is without even mentioning the abundance of resources made possible by consumer capitalism. Furthermore, the establishment of international bodies allegedly committed to accepting a universal system of ethics in many ways shows the extent of modernity's success and appeal, and likely has much to do with why we've enjoyed over 70 years of peace since the end of the Second World War. This is without even mentioning the internet, which has hosted the most radical democratization of knowledge in history, enabling many of us to learn things that only those lucky enough to attend university would have been able to do decades ago. And then there is, of course, the democratization of university education itself. But despite all of these perks, the modern world still feels like a very sanitary and lifeless place. Many of us acknowledge ourselves to have grown up among comforts that weren't even available to kings, but this only gives us more questions to be answered. Relatively speaking, how can we be so materially comfortable, have so many options with which to escape from the things that frustrate us, and yet still be so unhappy, confused, and frustrated about the world that gives us these comforts? Much of this is due to the fact that many of us who ask ourselves these questions have forgotten what happiness is, whilst being completely unaware of what modernity amounts to as a concept. This concept of modernity is what we're going to be discussing today. Modernity as a term has become almost ubiquitous over the last decade or so due to contemporary interest in it. However, it is often used incorrectly, sometimes being conflated with modernism and other times being used synonymously with enlightenment. This is extremely unhelpful because whilst there are similarities with both, they are not exactly the same thing. Enlightenment refers to the progression away from the presuppositions of myth-based societies of religion and towards the supremacy of reason. It's an intellectual movement that peaked in the 18th century and is closely interwoven with the rise of empirical science and philosophical rationalism, both of which strive for total knowledge. Enlightenment also has a humanistic dimension, which entailed the total abolition of religion in favour of advancing the universal rights of man as the arbiter of his own destiny. Immanuel Kant, in his essay What is Enlightenment, in fact describes the spirit of the Enlightenment age as the progressive realization of man from his self-incurred tutelage. Modernism, however, occurring 100 years later, was if anything a belated counter-reaction to the naive optimism of Enlightenment thought. This charge was led by the leading figures of the Frankfurt School. Whilst, to be sure, Adorno et al. Believed reason to be important, they were deeply concerned by the real-life consequences of developing a science based on assuming reason to have authority over nature. This is not to say that they reject the value of reason and objective truth, because they definitely don't. Their point is that in order to apprehend truth, properly speaking, one must commit to knowing the whole truth. And knowing the whole truth involves not just knowing the science, but knowing the subject's input in the production of that truth, the fallibility that comes with that input, and the fallibility of our input as scientists. The concept of modernity, and thus the ongoing project of the modern world, entails the ongoing realization of transcendent rational principles such as a universal system of ethics, whilst honouring our existence as unique, irreducibly particular persons who, as rational subjects ourselves, serve as reflective mediators for those principles which we assume to be universal. On the face of it, it sounds like in the modern world, the right balance has been struck. We have a commitment to realising the rights of man on the one hand and to defending the right to be ourselves on the other, which in turn allows us to reflect on whether those principles that we understand as rational are still rational or not. However, having done away with feudalism and restructuring society on meritocratic, secular and egalitarian principles, some rather unexpected results emerged, as French sociologist Émile Durkheim famously showed with France, when his study showed suicide rates to be 10 times higher in modern societies than they were in pre-modern ones. And today, we continue to hear claims about a silent mental health epidemic in the First World, despite the luxuries that we have and the advanced forms of treatment and escapism that we have as well. There is no simple answer as to why the realisation of ourselves as rational and self-determining is quite clearly having a deflating effect on so many of us. But on considering some of Hegel's insights on the matter, there are compelling reasons to believe that these things all stem from an irresolvable tension at the heart of the modern world itself, which is arguably a tragedy in unravelling in front of our very eyes. Hegel sees the modern world as the stage in history where the concrete universals of freedom proper are set, where we are allowed to exist in a state of nature on the one hand and be absolutely free as self-legislating individuals on the other. But in trying to develop this into a workable political system, he finds himself at a loss to overcome systemic problems such as poverty, alienation, and the gradual dissolution of the communitarian ethos that he wants to sustain. Whilst he does not commit to this view explicitly, he seems very much resigned to the fact that a true sense of communal holism cannot be reconciled with the principles of scientific social engineering which are essential to the modern world's instrumental dimension. Charles Taylor's interpretation of why is as follows. As labourers in modern society, we are not judged by our contributions in a qualitative sense, as in the aesthetic or intellectual value of what we produce, but are rather judged by what we achieve more or less as economic agents. Judging ourselves in this instrumental way, Hegel argues, directly encroaches on our ability to identify with the community in which we live, because our own ends have a strange way of becoming that world in which we live. Civil society, the purpose of which is to satisfy our particular wants and needs, seems to trap us into a form of solipsism. However, it is too simple to say that civil society is just there to provide what we want. It has a causal role in the things that we want as well. And this, Hegel argues, is due to the social dimension of commodification, where the expectations of others influence what we expect ourselves, even though the expectations of others are themselves built on a fetish of what everyone else wants as well. Because of the abstract and irrational nature of fashion, the expectations of what sufficient social recognition amounts to are constantly shifting, and it's just a fact of modern life that someone is going to find themselves behind or on the receiving end of the curve. To be sure, Hegel acknowledges the right to own property on the basis that it is a rational objectification of the particular will. This he attributes as an achievement of the Roman world. But in a series of lectures known as the Rail Philosophy, he explains that this comes at the cost of others economically and socially. The right of the rentier to thrive in the property market, for example, is the direct cost of the renter, whose potential deposit for a home of his own is placed straight into the hands of the rentier. This rentier in turn grows his business to the direct cost of other renters, many of whom will never own a home themselves as a result. The most affluent members of society perpetuate social poverty in a whole new sense. Envy, just through posturing the wealth that they have, which in turn has a coercive effect on the things that others want too. Hegel, however, offers reasons to be sympathetic to the blights of those affluent members of society who are recognised as high achievers. This is because in entering civil society, whether these people are entrepreneurs or simply high-salaried workers, they are immediately subject to abstract principles beyond their agency, which has a causal effect on what they do and what they think. What consumers ultimately want in civil society is unpredictable, not least because it is based on speculation. But in order to survive within it, these affluent people need to be on standby to adapt at virtually a moment's notice. Business owners have to keep tabs on their consumers and competitors, and salaried workers need to be ready to adapt whenever their labour conditions change. We cannot separate ourselves from these principles, no matter how abstract they are, because our right to attain our basic needs as persons depend on our ability to fulfil them. So these abstractions, in fact, become real, and for this reason we take them home with us. But is there really a place for home in the modern world? Well, family to Hegel is an inseparable part of what home is. Families allow home to function as a place of shelter from the necessary hardships of the world outside. But the modern world, without question, because of its unrelenting commitment to increasing efficiency, cutting costs, expanding margins, and so on, perpetuates an epidemic of loneliness through depriving people of the time to actually find partners and start families. And what goes particularly amiss is the added labour involved in not having a family as a social good. Many people today, of course, still have families, will have stay-at-home partners and children who can carry the burden of work that needs to be carried out at home, because homes require working on as well. But the demands of the modern world in turn comes with yet more added labour. For a single person, for example, who spends most of their time away from their living quarters and has suspended the pursuit of finding a lifelong partner to actualise their inner Ubermensch, home is not a place of recovery at all. In fact, it mostly feels little more than just another workhouse that they have to clean, with clothes that they have to iron and bills that they have to pay. More than likely, they'll spend most of their weekend doing just more forms of work that they can't do during the week because of their actual work. Traditionally, the family was the cornerstone for one's sense of being in the world, but the purpose of furthering our absolute freedom as individuals, or rather irreducibly particular persons, has left the concept of family being treated as something of a fetter. This rationalistic concept of self-determination, developing from the fixation on subjectivism, has led to women rejecting their traditional roles, and the new efficient modes of courtship, shall we say, coerce us into judging potential partners in fundamentally myopic ways that dramatically alters how we judge others in the real world. The modern world is, in many ways, amazing, but it feels terrible for so many of us because it has an odd way of keeping us running for reasons that we don't know, for rational purposes that don't even serve us, all to the cost of the simpler but more wholesome lives many of us actually want. It is for this reason that so many of us still dream of retiring to the country where we can own a farm and enjoy the fruits of our own labour in Robinson Crusoe-like fashion. The sad reality, however, is that the modern world has a way of justifying through its own totalistic reasoning why these wholesome things need to get into line. It is, you could say, imperialistic in nature, hence its constant compelling of us to justify why we value the things that we do, why we want to preserve the traditions that we wish to preserve, what purpose those things serve, and most importantly of all, whether they are rational. When brought into existence as a political constitution, rationality dispenses with anything that cannot justify itself on rational terms. Modernity has no time for the continued existence of things on the grounds of heritage alone. It cannot comprehend beauty or aesthetics of any kind, nor the moral fibre that people for generations may attach to their communities. And its attempts to prove otherwise just keep proving the opposite. It only seems to see value in brute realism. It is for this reason that instrumental rationality rules supreme, and us civilians serve a mere contingent role within this rational universe. It is no coincidence that since God fell after modernity came for him, the totality of materialism stepped up to fill the void. Individualism became the spirit of the age, and with this, we've been embarking on the progressive surrender of our being to the spurious infinity of commodification and consumption, to the point where we posit it as a virtue to treat others not as a kingdom of ends, as Kant encourages us to do, but others as a means for our ends. Why? Because everyone around us seems to be doing the same. This is perhaps everything we need to know about the intrinsically pathological concept of modernity, and why the modern world, for all its achievements, is so incompatible with the human spirit. In pursuing freedom, we've somehow regressed back into servitude, to myth. The myth of the modern individual who is absolutely free, content, and genuinely at home in the world.